In the late 1980s, just across the US-Mexico border, a dark force was quietly gathering strength. It was not just another drug cartel or criminal gang. Mexico had many of those already. What was unfolding in Matamoros was something far more sinister, a deadly mix of ritual sacrifice, superstition, and the violent world of narcotics trafficking. At the center of it all was a man whose name would soon strike terror into the hearts of both Mexicans and Americans: Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo. To understand the cult that would shock the world, we must first step back into his origins. Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo was born in Miami, Florida in 1962, but his life was destined to be anything but ordinary. His mother, a Cuban immigrant, was deeply involved in Santeria, a religion blending elements of Catholicism with African Yoruba traditions. From childhood, Adolfo was immersed in rituals, superstitions, and the belief in spiritual power. Neighbors recalled him as a boy who sometimes took part in strange ceremonies, always under the watchful guidance of his mother. To outsiders, it might have seemed like harmless folk religion, but for Adolfo, it was the seed of something far darker. As a teenager, Constanzo moved with his family to Mexico City, where his fascination with the occult deepened. He became captivated by Palo Mayombe, an Afro-Caribbean religion with roots in Central Africa. Unlike Santeria, which is often associated with healing and protection, Palo Mayombe can carry darker associations, especially when twisted for destructive purposes. Its rituals often involve the use of sacred cauldrons called ngangas, filled with animal remains, bones, and blood. Symbols of power that, in the wrong hands, could become tools of terror. Constanzo proved to be a quick learner and an ambitious follower. He trained under established priests, mastering the chants, the symbols, and the rituals. But he was not content to simply participate. He wanted control. He wanted power. And soon, he began to build a reputation as a brujo, a sorcerer who could manipulate fate, bring good fortune, and curse enemies. By the early 1980s, Constanzo's talents began to attract attention from a new clientele, drug traffickers. Mexico was becoming one of the key gateways for cocaine moving from South America into the United States, and drug lords were constantly searching for any edge they could find to protect their shipments, their money, and their lives. Constanzo offered them something different. While hitmen and bribes could buy temporary security, he promised supernatural protection. Through rituals of sacrifice and blood, he claimed he could make drug dealers invisible to the police and invincible to bullets. It was a promise that many were eager to believe. For men living in constant danger, the idea of magical invulnerability was too tempting to resist. Constanzo quickly gained followers within the drug underworld. He demanded loyalty, obedience, and payment, not just in money, but sometimes in offerings of animals and even humans. He convinced his believers that their fortunes were tied directly to his rituals. By the mid-1980s, Constanzo was no longer just a fortune teller or ritualist for hire. He was a leader, a cult figure who blended charisma, fear, and violence into a deadly mixture. Among his earliest recruits were people who would form the backbone of his cult, often referred to as Los Narcosatnicos, or the Narcosatanists. One of his closest disciples was Sarah Aldrete, a Mexican-American student from Brownsville, Texas. She was intelligent, charismatic, and, at first, fascinated by Constanzo's charm. But under his influence, she became something far more dangerous, a high priestess of the cult. Together, Constanzo and Aldrete built an organization that operated both as a drug smuggling network and a satanic sect, fusing the brutal logic of organized crime with the terrifying symbolism of blood sacrifice. Constanzo's rise coincided with the violent growth of Mexico's narco world. Rival cartels fought bloody battles for control of smuggling routes. Police and politicians were either bribed or silenced. In this environment, Constanzo offered something unique, a blend of fear and mysticism that could bind his followers more tightly than money alone. His rituals became legendary among his circle. He would slaughter animals such as goats, chickens, or snakes, placing their remains into the Nganga cauldron. But over time, these sacrifices escalated. He began to claim that human offerings were required to give the ultimate protection. Step by step, the line between superstition and slaughter was crossed. The cult began abducting people, sometimes rivals, sometimes random victims, whose blood and organs were offered to the cauldron. The killings were brutal and ritualistic, designed not just to kill, but to instill fear. His followers believed they were untouchable, shielded by dark magic. Matamoros, a bustling border town across from Brownsville, Texas, became the center of these horrors. From the outside, the city was like any other busy border community: bars, nightclubs, and a thriving black market. But in the shadows, Constanzo's cult was transforming it into a place of dread. Stories of disappearances circulated quietly. People whispered of dark ceremonies in remote ranches outside the city, and those who lived close to the cult knew to stay silent, because Constanzo's power was not only mystical, but also backed by guns, money, and ruthless violence. By the late 1980s, the stage was set for one of the most chilling chapters in Mexico's criminal history. Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo had built more than just a following. He had built an empire of fear, one that blurred the line between religion, crime, and pure evil. His cult was no longer just practicing rituals. It was killing in the name of magic, and the world was about to discover the horrifying truth behind the so-called Matamoros Cult. The cult that Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo built in Matamoros was unlike anything the region had ever seen. On the surface, it operated like a criminal network, trafficking drugs, collecting money, and eliminating rivals. But beneath that surface, it was fueled by a belief system twisted into something terrifying. For Constanzo and his followers, murder was not only a tool of control, but a ritual act of devotion. At the heart of these practices was the Nganga, the iron cauldron central to Palo Mayombe. Traditionally, it contained sticks, soil, bones, and offerings meant to channel spiritual power. But Constanzo's Nganga was different. He filled it with animal sacrifices at first: roosters, goats, snakes, even turtles, all slaughtered in elaborate ceremonies meant to strengthen his connection to supernatural forces. Over time, however, he escalated. He claimed that true power demanded human offerings, and his followers, already entranced by his charisma and promises of invincibility, obeyed without question. For Constanzo, these sacrifices had two purposes. One was mystical. He believed, or at least convinced others, that spilling blood and placing human remains in the nganga would please the spirits and grant them protection. The other was practical ritual killings, instilled fear, ensuring absolute loyalty from his followers and terror among those who might oppose him. Witnesses later described how these rituals took place in remote ranches outside Matamoros, often under the cover of night. Victims were bound, tortured, and mutilated before their remains were offered to the cauldron. Constanzo insisted that his cult members participate, binding them deeper into his web of control. Once they had killed in his name, there was no turning back. By the mid-1980s, Constanzo's reputation had spread beyond Matamoros. Drug traffickers and smugglers came to him seeking supernatural blessings. He promised to make them invisible to authorities and invincible in battle. To many in the narco underworld, his rituals became a form of insurance, a spiritual shield to go along with their weapons and bribes. Constanzo also demanded payment for his services. Sometimes it was money, but often it was in the form of drugs, weapons, or even people. Rival dealers or suspected traitors were some donated to the cult, becoming unwilling participants in the rituals. As the sacrifices grew more gruesome, Constanzo's aura of power only expanded. His followers began to truly believe that their success in smuggling and their ability to evade police was the direct result of the rituals. Among his inner circle, one figure stood out: Sarah Aldrate. Though she had once been a college student studying education, she was transformed under Constanzo's influence into the cult's high priestess. She helped recruit new followers, often luring them in with a mixture of charm and spiritual promises. Her presence added an air of legitimacy to the group, as if Constanzo's dark magic had both male and female divine authority. Other loyal disciples included drug traffickers, hitmen, and even corrupt police officers. Each was drawn in by a combination of fear and fascination. They were convinced that as long as they remained faithful to Constanzo, they would be untouchable. And for a time, that belief seemed justified. The cult operated in Matamoros with little interference. Police, often bribed or intimidated, turned a blind eye to disappearances. Bodies that were discovered were rarely connected back to the cult. Constanzo grew more confident and more ruthless. He began to refer to himself as not just a spiritual leader, but as El Padrino, the Godfather. His followers called him that with reverence. To them, he was more than human. He was a man touched by the divine, capable of controlling life and death. The murders carried out by the cult were horrifying in their brutality. Victims were often dismembered, their body parts placed into the nganga. Sometimes the rituals involved the removal of organs while victims were still alive, a cruelty meant to maximize the spiritual energy Constanzo claimed to harness. Human brains, hearts, spines, each had a role in his twisted ceremonies. The cult members believed that the more violent the death, the stronger the magic. The community of Matamoros began to live under a silent cloud of fear. People whispered about strange screams in the night, about missing friends and relatives, about shadows moving near the ranches on the outskirts of town. But speaking too loudly was dangerous. Those who knew too much risked becoming the next sacrifice. Despite the growing whispers, Constanzo and his cult thrived. Their drug operations expanded, moving cocaine and marijuana across the border into the United States. They developed a network that stretched into Texas, using rituals to keep their followers loyal and their enemies terrified. For many months, their blend of crime and mysticism kept them untouchable. But with each sacrifice, with each act of bloodshed, the cult drew closer to the edge of exposure. The brutality of their rituals could only stay hidden for so long. While Constanzo believed that the spirits were protecting him, in reality, it was only a matter of time before his actions attracted the wrong kind of attention. The turning point would come not from a cartel rival or a betrayed follower, but from the disappearance of a young American student whose name would forever be linked to the cult, Mark Kilroy. His abduction and murder in 1989 would shine a light on the horrors of the Matamoros Cult, pulling back the veil of secrecy that Constanzo had carefully maintained. The rituals that had once given the cult power would become the very evidence that brought their empire crashing down. The world was about to see what had been hidden in the darkness of Matamoros. The terrifying truth of ritual killings blended with drug trafficking, a story unlike any other in modern crime history. Spring break along the U.S.-Mexico border has long been a magnet for American college students. Each year, thousands of young people cross into towns like Matamoros for a taste of nightlife, cheap drinks, and adventure. In March of 1989, one of those students was Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old pre-med major from the University of Texas. He was bright, athletic, and well-liked. A young man with his whole future ahead of him. What happened to Mark would not only shatter his family's life, but would also tear the mask off one of the most disturbing cults in modern history. On the night of March 14, 1989, Mark and 3 friends drove from Brownsville, Texas, across the border into Matamoros. The city was buzzing with spring break crowds, the streets alive with music and laughter. For hours, the group moved from one bar to another, blending in with the festive atmosphere. But sometime in the early morning hours, after leaving a club, Mark Kilroy vanished. At first, his friends assumed he had simply gotten lost in the crowd. They searched frantically, calling out his name, checking nearby streets, but there was no trace. By dawn, panic had set in. Mark's friends contacted the police, and soon his disappearance became a high-profile case. Unlike many locals who had gone missing in Matamoros, Mark was an American citizen. His disappearance ignited immediate concern on both sides of the border. The United States consulate became involved, as did Texas law enforcement. Flyers with Mark's photo were distributed throughout the region, and his family flew down to join the search. His parents pleaded publicly for his safe return. The case quickly attracted media attention, with newspapers and television stations covering the story of the missing college student. What investigators didn't know at first was that Mark Kilroy had not simply been kidnapped for ransom or caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been specifically targeted by members of Constanzo's cult. Witnesses later revealed that cult members had been prowling the streets that night, looking for a suitable victim for their next ritual. When they saw Mark, young, healthy, and alone, they decided he would be the perfect sacrifice. According to confessions that came later, Mark was lured toward a parked car where cult members struck him and forced him inside. He was driven to a remote ranch outside of Matamoros, a place that would later become infamous, Rancho Santa Elena. It was here that Constanzo conducted his most brutal ceremonies. For hours, Mark was held captive. He may not have known exactly who his captors were or what they intended, but he surely understood the danger he was in. By the next day, Constanzo ordered the ritual to begin. Mark was tortured and eventually killed. His brain was removed and placed into the inganga, while other parts of his body were used in the ceremony. To the cult, it was just another sacrifice to empower their magic. To the outside world, it was the loss of a young man whose only mistake was celebrating spring break in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the search for Mark intensified, law enforcement on both sides of the border worked tirelessly. Mexican police, under pressure from U.S. authorities, began stopping cars at checkpoints near Matamoros. It was during one of these stops that they encountered a vehicle driven by a known drug trafficker linked to Constanzo's group. Suspicion grew, and soon investigators began to piece together a trail that led directly to Rancho Santa Elena. When police raided the ranch in early April 1989, what they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. Buried across the property were dozens of bodies, many mutilated in horrific ways. Investigators uncovered shallow graves filled with bones and decomposed remains. In a shed, they discovered the cult's inganga, an iron cauldron filled with blood, animal parts, and human remains. Inside were not only animal skulls, but also human vertebrae and even a brain. The scene shocked even hardened police officers. It was evidence of ritualistic murder on a scale that defied belief. The remains of Mark Kilroy were among those discovered, his body mutilated in line with the cult's gruesome practices. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to identify other victims, many of whom were locals who had quietly disappeared over the years. The discovery quickly made international headlines. Newspapers called the group the Narcosatanists, highlighting the bizarre mix of drug trafficking and satanic ritual. The case horrified Americans, particularly parents of college students who often traveled to Mexico for spring break. The idea that a young man could be kidnapped off the street, sacrificed, and mutilated in the name of dark magic was almost too much to comprehend. The global spotlight put enormous pressure on Mexican authorities to bring those responsible to justice. Raids were conducted across Matamoros, and several cult members were arrested. Among those captured was Sara Aldrate, who denied her involvement at first, but was soon revealed to have been deeply embedded in the cult's hierarchy. As the investigation unfolded, chilling details emerged. Cult members admitted to killing at least 15 people, though some estimates placed the number of victims much higher. They described how Constanzo ordered each ritual, how the victims were chosen, and how the remains were used to feed the Inganga. The killers showed no remorse, insisting that the sacrifices had protected them in their criminal dealings. For Mark Kilroy's family, the discovery brought devastating closure. They had prayed for his safe return, only to learn that he had suffered a brutal fate at the hands of a cult they could scarcely comprehend. His death galvanized public anger, sparking outrage not only in the United States, but across Mexico. The exposure of the Matamoros Cult marked a turning point. For years, Constanzo and his followers had operated in the shadows, blending crime and ritual in a way that shielded them from scrutiny. But the abduction of an American student drew an international spotlight that could not be ignored. The cult's secrets were out. Still, one question remained. Where was Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo? While several members of his cult had been captured, the leader himself remained at large, and as the manhunt intensified, Constanzo was preparing for a violent final act that would cement his place in the annals of true crime history. The discovery at Rancho Santa Elena had ripped the veil off one of the darkest chapters in Mexico's modern history. Dozens of mutilated bodies, evidence of ritual killings, and the murder of an American student had placed the Matamoros Cult at the center of global attention. But one figure was still missing: Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo, the man known as El Padrino. For weeks after the raid, he remained at large, evading capture and fueling rumors of his supernatural powers. The manhunt for Constanzo became as much a battle against myth as against the criminal himself. After the raid, Mexican authorities intensified their operations. Arrested cult members pointed investigators toward safe houses where Constanzo had once lived. Witnesses spoke of his paranoia, his belief that the police and the media were closing in. He moved constantly between Mexico City and nearby apartments, accompanied by his inner circle of disciples. Among them were Sarah Aldrete, the so-called High Priestess, and several loyal followers who had participated in the murders. Constanzo believed his arrest was inevitable, but surrender was never an option. To his followers, he preached that death was preferable to capture. He reminded them of the rituals they had performed, promising that even in death, the spirits would protect them. The stage was set for a violent final confrontation. On May 6, 1989, after weeks of searching, police tracked Constanzo to an apartment building in Mexico City. Acting on a tip, heavily armed officers surrounded the location. Inside the apartment, Constanzo, Aldrete, and several of his most trusted followers realized that their time had run out. What happened next was a chaotic and bloody standoff that played out in real time. As police closed in, Constanzo opened fire from the apartment windows, spraying the street below with automatic weapons. Witnesses described a terrifying scene: bullets raining down, screams from bystanders, and officers ducking for cover. The firefight continued for nearly an hour, with Constanzo refusing to give himself up. He hurled insults and threats at the police, daring them to come inside. But as the gunfight dragged on, Constanzo's confidence faltered. Realizing the police would not back down, he made a chilling decision. Rather than be captured alive, he ordered one of his loyal followers, Alvaro de León Valdez, nicknamed Il Dubi, to shoot him. Witnesses later recounted that Constanzo shouted,
"Do it! Kill me! Kill me now!"
Moments later, El Dube raised his weapon and opened fire, striking Constanzo and one of his companions. The self-proclaimed godfather of the cult collapsed, lifeless, ending the reign of terror he had commanded for years. When police finally stormed the apartment, they found Constanzo's bullet-riddled body sprawled on the floor. Beside him lay his disciple, also dead. Sarah Aldrete and others were taken into custody alive, though shaken and terrified. The standoff had ended not with the capture of a criminal mastermind, but with his violent, self-inflicted demise. News of Constanzo's death spread rapidly. Newspapers carried graphic photos of his body, proof that the so-called invincible sorcerer was, in the end, only a man. For many, it was a relief, symbolic victory against the aura of fear and superstition he had cultivated. But for others, especially in Matamoros, the horror lingered. The bodies at Rancho Santa Elena, the gruesome details of the rituals, and the cult's ruthless violence were not easily forgotten. In the aftermath, trials began for the surviving cult members. Sarah Aldrete maintained her innocence, insisting she had been manipulated and trapped by Constanzo's charisma. Prosecutors, however, presented evidence of her active participation, from recruiting new members to attending rituals. Ultimately, she was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison, where she remains to this day. Other followers received long sentences as well, their testimonies painting a disturbing picture of blind loyalty and ritualistic murder. The case left Mexico reeling. It exposed the depth of corruption that had allowed such a cult to operate unchecked for so long. Police officers, bribed or intimidated, had ignored disappearances and strange rumors. Only the international pressure following Mark Kilroy's murder had forced authorities to act decisively. The scandal forced many to confront the uncomfortable truth that superstition and crime had intertwined in a way that endangered ordinary people. For the Kilroy family, the outcome was bittersweet. They had lost their son in a way too horrific to fully comprehend, but the exposure of the cult ensured that his death was not in vain. Their fight for justice drew attention to the dangers along the border, leading to increased awareness of cartel violence and the vulnerabilities of tourists in Mexico. Mark's memory became a rallying cry for safer conditions, even as his parents continued to grieve. The legacy of the Matamoros cult endures decades later. The story has inspired documentaries, books, and films, often focusing on the shocking blend of narcotics and ritual sacrifice. The term Narcosatanists still evokes images of cauldrons filled with blood, black magic rituals, and young lives stolen in the name of power. Even now, locals in Matamoros sometimes whisper about the cult, insisting that traces of Constanzo's dark influence linger in the region. The case also forced scholars and law enforcement to reconsider how belief systems could be twisted to justify violence. Palo Mayom, Santeria, and similar religions are not inherently violent, yet in Constanzo's hands, their imagery became a weapon. He exploited faith, fear, and desperation, turning them into tools of control. His cult was less about religion and more about domination. An empire of fear built on superstition and bloodshed. Looking back, the Matamoros Cult remains one of the most disturbing examples of how crime and ritual can merge into something almost unimaginable. It was not just about money or drugs. It was about belief, the conviction that killing could grant protection, that spilling blood could bring power, that one man could hold the keys to life and death. In the end, Constanzo's promises of invincibility proved false. His nganga, filled with the remains of countless victims, could not save him from bullets. His rituals, meant to shield his followers, only exposed their crimes to the world. The man who called himself El Padrino died not as a god, but as a fugitive undone by his own violent creed. Yet his story continues to haunt the borderlands, a grim reminder of how easily fear and superstition can be weaponized. The Matamoros Cult may have ended in 1989, but its legacy, a blend of horror tragedy and dark fascination, lives on as one of the most chilling chapters in modern true crime.